Hello, everyone. Sam here, and we gotta talk about Daughter of the Dragon, May Wong's Rendezvous with American History. This is another nonfiction book, and this was written by Yunte Huang. I believe that's how it's pronounced. Uh, and this was published in 2023. Uh, Huang is not an author I really know well, but he has done a lot of books on Asian American figures. And this book is actually the third in a trilogy he was doing, focused on Asian American figures. His first book was about the original Siamese twins and how they came over to America. And his second was about Charlie Chan, the famous Chinese detective. And Huang is Chinese himself, and according to his author biography, currently lives in Santa Barbara. But this is the last book of his Asian American focused trilogy, and this story talks about May Wong, who was a Chinese American actress in the early 20th century and whose career spanned multiple decades from, I believe, the 1920s to the 1960s. And by 1960s, I mean 1960 when she passed. But a very long spanning career and one of the most recognizable Asian American actresses of her time. So this book examines her life and all the events that were happening around it at the time, particularly in regards to American attitudes towards the Chinese and what was going on in China at the time itself. I got interested in this story last year because last year my local library was doing an event for Asian American Heritage Month, which is in May, and this book was actually displayed in their big shelf of books that were focused on Asian Americans. So I'd seen this last year, and I think I checked it out once, read a little bit of it, then kind of put it aside. I had other things I was focused on at the time. But recently I'd started reading the Fu Manchu stories by Sax Rohmer, and I was going over the history of Fu Manchu adaptations, and I saw that May Wong had actually been in a Fu Manchu movie. It was called Daughter of the Dragon. So I kind of thought, well, that's my excuse to check this out, especially since that film's title is used for the title of Wong's biography by Huang. So I was figuring, oh well, it must have played a significant role in Wong's life, and apparently it did. So it got me reinterested in the book, and I decided, oh, might as well check it out. So that's what we're going to do today. So first I wanted to talk about what worked in this story. I say story, it's a nonfiction narrative going over all of May Wong's life, but nonfiction can still be a story, as we'll soon see. I think the thing I enjoyed most about it is that there's a very good discussion about Wong's most famous films that she made. Like her most famous, one of her most famous silent films was the Thief of Baghdad, which was with I believe it was Douglas Fairbanks Sr., I believe, and it also talks about the titular Daughter of the Dragon. And these movies get a lot of focus in this, and Huang does a good job discussing, how Wong managed to get the part, how she sort of approached these characters, what the cultural context of her being in these movies was. And he does a very good job with these well-known films of Wong's. I also thought that the first half of the book was very interesting because it talks a lot about not just Wong's upbringing, but the sort of strange fixation Hollywood had on Chinese customs and culture, and how a lot of early Hollywood films, even go back to the 1910s and 20s, were really interested in Chinese culture and sort of finding ways to depict it, often through yellowface, but the fascination was still there, and how in a lot of ways Hollywood was primed for an actress like May Wong, because you had a Chinese actress who had grown up in a Chinese laundry, which was very associated with Chinese people at the time. So she was very much a right person at the right time sort of deal. And that was very interesting, sort of seeing how this confluence of events of the cultural history of Chinese Americans sort of converge with the growth of Hollywood, and how, despite the prejudices of the time, May Wong was able to get her head in the door and really make an impact as an Asian American actress, especially in films where she was still heavily restricted in what kind of character type she could play. I also really liked how Huang shows the intricacies of 1920s and 30s racial dynamics. Because obviously he talks about the anti-Chinese sentiment in America. Obviously that's a given. He had to talk about that at some point. But he also points out how a lot of the Chinese and other Asian people had sort of conflicting values with regards to race in their own sense. Because there's one chapter that deals with an actor, I believe his name is Warner Orland? Was that his name? He was the guy who played, Warner Oland, my mistake. Warner Oland, who was actually the guy who played Fu Manchu several times, and I believe he actually played him in Daughter of the Dragon with May Wong as Fu Manchu's daughter. And there's this one section where Huang shows the Oland and Wong meeting in Asia, and despite the fact that Warner Oland had been in yellowface when he depicted Fu Manchu, as well as Charlie Chan, he was actually more accepted by the Chinese populace than Wong was, despite the fact that Wong actually was Chinese, whereas Oland was not. And it kind of showed sort of this interesting element of Chinese culture where Oland's depiction of yellowface was somewhat insulting, but they sort of saw it as, artistic and acceptable, because by this point Oland was not playing Fu Manchu, he was playing Charlie Chan, who was a heroic Chinese figure. And the Chinese absolutely loved Charlie Chan, at least at this point, and really liked Oland's depiction. But because May Wong had portrayed Fu Manchu's daughter, even though she was not in yellowface, the Chinese still like booed her because she was there was sort of an Huang explains as there was kind of an implication, oh, you're like betraying your race or your people, and just sort of looking down on her for doing a villainous dragon lady role, even though she was ethnically the correct person to do it, and Oland was the one in yellowface, but Oland was accepted because he was doing a more heroic character than Wong was. So Wong was kind of poo-pooed, while Oland was applauded. And it kind of points out that, yeah, the Chinese were kind of hypocritical in that respect. And the story also does not whitewash Wong's own prejudices, because obviously in the 1930s, when the Sino-Japanese War breaks out, Wong is very anti-Japanese. She hates them for what they're doing to her home country. And her anti-Japanese statements really ramp up during World War II, and she actually stars in some war propaganda films, really slamming the Japanese and portraying a Chinese heroine fighting against the Japanese. But the story makes no bones about the fact that she says like really nasty things about Japanese people, to the point that even the American government, who is putting Japanese people in internment camps, is kind of going, and that there are some, the anti-Japanese fervor is so strong with Anna May Wong that it gets a little excessive for some people. So it does not whitewash her personal beliefs towards others. And I really appreciate that Huang emphasizes that, yeah, there was a lot of white racism against Chinese, but there were also sort of hatreds among different Asian nations towards each other. The Chinese, the Japanese, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans. Like, just they were all kind of ugly towards each other. So it does not whitewash anybody's prejudices. And I think the thing that this story did very well is that it showed how adaptable Wong was to the trends of filmmaking. Because she starts her career in the silent films. And, of course, silent films eventually transitioned to talkies, and there were a lot of actors and actresses who lost their jobs the second sound came in because they just didn't have good voices, or they were just kind of clunky with the staging that was required for sound films. But Anna May Wong is able to adapt to it. And it's actually difficult for her because this Huang points out she was raised in Los Angeles, so she has kind of a mixture of a Chinese accent with, a California accent, which is a bit of a strange situation. And when she first goes on stage to do the stage performance in Britain, the British all boo her because they say, "Oh yeah, she talks so strange. She has this mixture of Chinese and Californian American accent. Like, oh, it's terrible." But she was able to get dialect training so that her accent was not as offending to certain ears. And it obviously paid off because she got a fair amount of roles after the sound films came in. And there's also this interesting section towards the end where, as Wong gets middle-aged, this is around the time television starts taking off, and Huang shows how Wong was actually able to adapt to television, which A lot of aging stars really weren't able to, but she does, and she actually even gets her own show. I believe it. What is it called? The Gallery of Madame Lusong, and she was actually the main character of this TV show. So she was a middle-aged Asian American woman with her own TV show in, I believe it was 1959, 1958, somewhere around there. So she was very much pioneering in that respect. Sadly, the Gallery of Madame Li Zong is apparently lost, so we didn't get to see that. But a lot of her guest spots on television were preserved, so we get to at least see a lot of her television performances that when she was doing guest spots on different TV shows. And Huang makes it clear that if Wong had not died prematurely in her mid-50s, it's largely suspected her alcoholism might have exacerbated her death. If she had kept going, she might have been a dependable presence on television for another 15 to 20 years. She might have been very successful in that respect. But it was not to be. So I really appreciated Huang showing how adaptable Wong was to all these different mediums that popped up in such a short amount of time. It really does make her out to be an impressive performer. And I'm definitely curious to see what her performances were like after reading this, because she certainly sounds like a fascinating actress. So I've talked about the things I did like about this Daughter of the Dragon, the book, not Wong herself. This is the book. But I now want to talk about the things that I didn't care for as much with this book, and sadly, there's more of it than I initially thought. Like after I read this book, I was going, "Oh yeah, here's all the good things, here are all the weak things." And I thought, "Oh, the weak things, I'll write that in 5 minutes." But the more I thought about and I read back over the book, the more I realized, oh yeah, there's actually quite a few things wrong with this book, or maybe not wrong, but weaknesses, I would say. They weaken the book's point. The biggest thing I noticed right off the bat is that the book does not discuss a lot of Wong's more obscure films, because a lot of Anime Wong's works, especially in the silent era, are sort of bit parts. She doesn't appear in them very long, or is barely visible. And Huang talks about some of them, but then he just moves on. And some of them he doesn't bring up, period. And it's kind of baffling, because the whole point is talking about Anime Wong's roles, but unless it's like Daughter of the Dragon or The Thief of Baghdad or Shanghai Express, you're only getting a paragraph at most, and sometimes you get nothing. There was one movie in here, I don't remember which one, but there was one here that she had done in like one of her last movies she ever did, but it's just not mentioned, and it's kind of like, well, why didn't you bring up that one? But it is kind of frustrating reading this and having this huge tome. Like, this is a thick book. You can see through this. It's nice and thick, but we don't get much information about some of her more obscure roles. It's kind of like, well, and I guess the argument you could make is that maybe they just weren't that interesting of films, but it's kind of like, there's plenty of films in here that don't seem that interesting, but he still gives them a paragraph. It's kind of like, if you're going to be a complete discussion of Wong's career, at least tried to make it complete, even if there's not much to say about certain movies. And that kind of leads into my next criticism, which is the first half of this book I said I really enjoyed. I liked the explaining of the culture of China, of Chinese Americans, and how that sort of coalesced into Hollywood. And I liked the talking about Anna May Wong's beginnings. But the second half of the book really drags because there's a part where in the mid 30s, Anna May Wong goes to China because she wants to get in touch with her roots, see her father's homeland, and just get more in touch with her heritage. But once we enter that part, the story just drags because Huang goes into such insane detail about every little thing that's going on in like Shanghai or Hong Kong, and at one point I think she's hanging out in the Philippines or something. But he just goes on and on about all this minutia regarding these individuals and these places, and it just gets kind of overwhelming, and to the point that Wong sometimes is not even a main feature in some of these chapters. Like it just kind of drags the whole point of the book to a halt, where we're suddenly talking about the history of Shanghai and Hong Kong and all these other places and all the people in them. And it's like, well, I recognize that you kind of have to talk about the history if you're going to relate it to Anna May Wong, but it's just written the way that the story just kind of grinds to a halt, and it feels like we're going on an extended travelogue, and it really hurts the story because afterwards, when Anna May Wong gets back from China, suddenly all the talk about her career sort of grinds to a halt. Like, it still goes on, but it's not nearly as in depth as that first half was, and her film career, granted, her film career is slowing by this point, but it's also a thing where the discussion of her filmography just sort of grinds to a halt. It's like after the big China trip, we're just kind of spinning. We're just going through the motions. Like, okay, yeah, she was in a couple other films after this. Whoop, now she's dead. And it's kind of like we had such insane amounts of detail for the China trip, but her final few years is like weirdly, I guess taciturn might be the word. Like Huang he talks about it, but he doesn't talk about it in nearly as much detail. And to add insult to injury, this book doesn't even have a complete filmography of Anna May Wong, just a selected filmography, which I thought was kind of somewhat of a slap in the face. Like, you're devoting all this much energy to Anna May Wong, but you're not going to provide a complete filmography of her films and even of her television appearances. Like, that seems a bit against the spirit of the book. And that kind of leads to my other main criticism of this story, is that China trip that I mentioned, as I said, a lot of times it kind of just ignores Anna May Wong after a point, just goes on about these other places before sort of awkwardly trying to bring Anna May Wong back into the story. And that's kind of a common theme throughout the book, even before and after the China trip, where Huang will deviate from Wong as a subject numerous times to talk about these other tangential subjects that usually are, but sometimes aren't really related to Wong. And it just really interrupts the flow of the story, where we're deeply focused on Wong, and then suddenly we're talking about, like, the history of the Hong Kong colony, how the British took over it, or some other thing about, like, certain Chinese customs. And a lot of them are just sort of awkwardly shoved in. Uh, there's one chapter where Huang says, he opens up the chapter saying something along the lines of, "Let me divert from the story of Anna May Wong for a moment," which I was like, you've been doing that for a third of the book. Like, there's like, at the point he does it in a book, like, maybe a third of the actual book is about Anna May Wong, and the rest of it is about all this other stuff that surrounds Wong. And it's kind of like, the tangential subjects almost take over the book, to the point that Wong herself is not really as much of the focus in a lot of parts. And that's sort of the thing. Huang gets so caught up in all of this research that he did, and the research is impressive. He lists all of the sources in the back. He went through a lot of stuff, and I'm sure this was a very hard book to put together. I am not dismissing his research, or the efforts it took to research. It's impressive on a research scale. But unfortunately, the problem with, and I've experienced this problem writing nonfiction myself, is that sometimes you get this, like, really cool research and resource you really want to use. It's really cool, but as you write your book and you iron things out, you kind of realize that resource and knowledge that you were trying to pull from it really isn't that important to the overall story. So even as much as you hate it, you kind of have to leave to the side. But I don't think Huang did this. He's done such insane amounts of research and all this minutia that he gets kind of caught up in it. He gets so focused on these small details and this, like, interesting side information that he sort of overloads the book with these superfluous details. And the great irony of that is that this is a book that's meant to highlight Anna May Wong's contributions as an artist, but in this book she's kind of pushed to the side, and for as much as Huang is poo-pooing all these racist American producers who would not let her truly spread her wings, he's ironically kind of doing the same thing by not focusing on Wong nearly as much as he should, and just sort of taking all this research and stuffing so much of it in the book that Wong doesn't really get a chance to shine in many cases. So it kind of defeats the book's point. If the whole point is to highlight her contributions to cinema, it's like, well, if you wanted that, why didn't you just, like, focus on her and not weigh us all down with these interesting but sort of inane details? So that really sort of ruins the book's point in a lot of ways, at least in my opinion, because when you put so much detail into it that the main character and the main person you're supposed to focus on isn't focused on, that becomes a bit of a problem, especially when the whole point is highlighting their contributions. There's also a bit of a problem regarding author bias. And the author bias is regarding the Chinese Civil War. Because for those that don't know Chinese history, there was a Chinese Civil War that started raging, I believe it was in the late 20s. And it was against the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists led by Mao Zedong. And Huang paints a much more sympathetic portrait of the communists than the nationalists. In fact, the story spends a lot of time demonizing the nationalist side of the Chinese Civil War, while never really discussing any of the questionable actions the communist Chinese did both before they won the war and after they won the war. And like one example is at one point Huang is talking about how Mao had to retreat from the invading Japanese, and he frames it as this like glorious achievement, like oh, they marched over 1,000 miles to safety, thousands of the troops die, and he frames it as like very glorious, like this glorious work. But Chiang Kai-shek does not get any such decent portrayal. Like, he's essentially Snidely Whiplash in this story. Like, nothing he does is like of any useful or like somewhat admirable action. Like, he's a cartoon supervillain, and that really stands out compared to what good old Chairman Mao did to his own people. So it's kind of like, yeah, that's a bit of a strange bias there. And again, I probably wouldn't have cared that much, but they really emphasize it. Like, anytime the nationalists come up, they are the worst people ever. And the communists are just kind of, they're either not talked about, or they're like, there's this sort of gloriousness to them that's not necessarily done in a way that's necessarily obvious, but it's definitely framed in a way of like, oh, you're like, yeah, these guys are the real heroes. And it's kind of like, that's a bit of a that history does not bear that out. Now look, I'm well aware nationalists were not necessarily good guys. Chiang Kai-shek definitely was not a goody two-shoes or the greatest dude to ever live. But it does kind of feel dishonest to portray one side as like evil incarnate and not point out the stuff that the communists did both during wartime and afterwards. And probably the biggest tell is that there's one point in like the second to last chapter where Huang brings up the things that were going on in China at the time in the 50s, and he portrays Chiang Kai-shek as a Snidely Whiplash, like plotting on Taiwan to get China back, like this like really over the top depiction of him. But when he brings up Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, the thing that killed millions of Chinese, he frames it in like a weird, like in this weird way that like sort of implies that like, oh, it was a bad thing, but it just kind of happened with a little bit of mismanagement, and it's like it was a little more than mismanagement. Yeah, here's how he frames it. Under the great helmsman, that's Mao, Red China was reeling from the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward, a 3-year utopian campaign that commenced in 1958 and ended with millions of people starved to death. And in the very next sentence says, in Taiwan, where the defeated nationalists had taken refuge under the protection of the Pacific fleets of the U.S. Navy, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek ruled the island under martial law, suppressing political opposition with military tribunals and white terror, while plotting to reclaim his lost domain. Like, Chiang Kai-shek is just a supervillain, the way he frames it here, but the way he talks about the Great Leap Forward, he discusses it as if, like, yeah, it's a tragedy, but it was a utopian campaign. We were trying to make things better, and it's like he says, calls Mao the great helmsman, and it doesn't come off like ironic, like he's saying, oh Mao, you're such a great helmsman. It comes off like he's just praising him, so It's such a weird thing to say, uh, and it's just such an obvious bias that it kind of stands out. And as I'll explain later, it does kind of ruin some of the book's messages going forward. Now, one thing I do have to say, even though Huang himself is living in America, he is Chinese. And he mentions in his book that he actually has Chinese family at home. And I'm my suspicion, it could be that he's enthralled to the communist regime, but there's also the possibility that he does not want to anger the Chinese regime, considering what they do to political dissidents and often people connected to said dissidents. So a part of me wonders if maybe he's being like glowing towards the communists and not the nationalists out of, self-preservation. 'Cause things might not turn out well for his loved ones if he was maybe not as glowing towards the communists. And this is actually a problem. A lot of people talk about how Hollywood tries to cater to the Chinese, but it happens in the publishing industry too. There was this one book I read called Three Tigers, One Mountain. And it was all about the political powers of Asia and how they had rivalries with each other. It mostly focused on Japan, the Koreas, and China, as well as a little bit of Taiwan. And that nonfiction story kind of had a similar handicap because the author Michael Booth didn't want to offend the Chinese government due to his fear of his books being censored. He doesn't directly say this in the book, but he sort of lets it slip in the book that a lot of his books sell well in China. So it doesn't take a genius to put two and two together and go, oh, so you don't want to anger the Chinese because they might ban your book. And one of my big criticisms of that book was that it really downplayed the crimes of the Chinese government while it was highlighting every single crime against humanity that the Japanese, Koreans, and Taiwanese had done. And it felt very uneven in that respect because Michael Booth wouldn't touch China. And that's kind of the problem I have with this book, too, just in the sense of it screams all about the nationalist foibles, but it never mentions the stuff the communists did. So it is a flaw in the book. Huang may have reasons for writing it that way. This is not a judgment on Huang himself, but yeah, it is a problem with the book, and I think it does impact its focus on history. And sort of going back to that bias Huang has against the nationalists, it kind of ruins the book's message at one point because a lot of the book is pretty much bluntly stating that America mistreated Chinese immigrants in the early 20th century, which is true. And a lot of the book is just about how American racism basically affected May Wong's career and how it often stalled it in several instances. But the complaint somewhat falls flat because at one point there's an entire chapter in this book dedicated to Madame Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek's wife, when she was doing this tour of the United States during World War II to try and drum up support for the nationalist regime during World War II to fight the Japanese. And despite the fact that earlier in the book, Huang was criticizing white writers for doing the Dragon Lady stereotype of like this strong, scheming Asian woman who controls men and seduces them and does all these awful things through her sinister femininity. He goes back on that to depict Madame Kaisek as a real dragon lady. And it kind of makes the message very mixed. Like, he spends all this time lambasting the dragon lady persona, that stereotype, but then he just openly calls Madame Kaisek that. And the lesson I get from is not, oh, these stereotypes are bad, you shouldn't use them. I get the message that, oh, racist stereotypes are fine when it's used against a figure I don't like. And it's kind of like, but that's what every racist does. Like, that's like, it very much conflicts with the whole point that he was making earlier in the book. And it's all just to crap on this political figure he doesn't like. And it also is like, it sort of unintentionally implies that people who have these racist opinions of Asian women are right to be suspicious of Chinese and Asian people, because apparently this Chinese wife of a Chinese general, she's up to no good. She's doing dragon lady things, something that Huang pretty much outright says. And so I just go, well, what's the... What you're just sort of shooting your whole point in the foot, Huang, just because, to make this dig at Madame Kaisek. And it's like, you spent the whole first half of the story deploring racist stereotypes, and now you're just doing racist stereotypes. And there is a point where Huang tries to sort of be self-aware, kind of say, well, I know I'm using the dragon lady thing, and it's a little bit questionable, but it really matches to what Madame Kaisek was like. But it feels very insincere. It feels like sort of a damage control thing, where he had this idea, oh yeah, Kaisek is like a dragon lady, but then he didn't think through the fact that, well, you just spent the whole first half of the book decrying the dragon lady persona, and now you're writing her as a dragon lady. And so he kind of had this weird cognitive dissonance where he wanted to have his cake and eat it too. He wanted Madame Kaisek as the dragon lady, but he also wanted to criticize all the racist white writers who use that same sort of persona when writing Asian women. So it just comes off as hypocrisy, and that's actually what really made the portrayal of the nationalists compared to the communists really stand out to me, because it's kind of like, well, yeah, you're jumping through hoops to make the Chiang Kai-shek and his wife look like evil incarnate, but you don't even touch Mao Zedong or anybody associated with him, who arguably has just as big a body count and in some ways has made China worse, arguably. So again, it's also kind of hard to take all this simping, because that's what it is. It's simping for communist China, considering the fact that modern day China enacts racist policies against their own minorities. Ask anybody what how the Uyghurs are feeling from their concentration camps. So it just really puts a burner on this book, because Huang spends the whole book trying to decry American society as racist, but running defense for another society that is deeply racist. So, and again, I wouldn't have commented on this because, yeah, I realize nobody has full control of what their government is doing. I'm not going to declare someone to be sinful because of what their government does. But when you go to the lengths that Huang does to, like, really finger wag at American culture and the nationalists while saying nothing about the communist regime that is doing a lot of things that America was once doing. America was once putting Japanese in internment camps. Well, the Chinese are doing it right now, but for Uyghurs. So, yeah, so all of these, like, finger waggings and accusatory finger points, they kind of fall flat because, you're kind of doing them. So, again, and this is really annoying because it kind of defeats the book's main purpose. Where the attempts to decry historical racism fall flat because Huang is running damage control for a racist regime that is still actively hurting people. And worst of all, like I mentioned earlier, it sidelines May Wong, so the book kind of falls flat in all these weird political diatribes because it minimizes May Wong, who is meant to be the focus of this book. Excuse me. So it's a very deeply annoying thing. And yeah, he'd have to talk about the politics at some point, but again, because he has this weird fixation on the nationalists and shoves May Wong to the side, a lot of these things, the whole point of the book sort of falls apart because you're you're complaining about historical racism while supporting a regime that is currently doing racist activities. And then you make this whole book to make a triumphant declaration of May Wong's career, but she's often sidelined in the book itself. So, again, there's just a lot of self-defeating elements in this story where the main point Huang is trying to do and make gets sidelined because Huang himself can't help but focus on these minutiae and prop up a regime because of that, the whole point of the story sort of falls apart. So that's sort of the sad element of this, where May Wong doesn't. I don't think May Wong gets as much of her due as she should in this book, and because Huang runs defense for modern day China's improprieties, I guess we could say, it sort of ruins his whole point about historical racism, because it's like, well, you're running defense for a regime that is happening right now and is actively harming minority groups in their own country. So it's sort of like, well, I don't feel as bad. I don't really feel a sense of responsibility for my ancestors' racism because you're not really taking accountability for your own country's current day racist policies. So like I said, there's just a bunch of these things that when it gets really focused on the politics, it can sometimes shoot itself in the foot. So yeah, that was not a very fun part of this book. So the final ranking of Daughter of the Dragon. This was kind of a tough one to figure out because it does a couple of things really well, but given that long section I just did about what it doesn't do right, there's a lot of things that really drag it down. I guess at the end I will give it 2 out of 5 stars. I go by a 5-star system. I give it 2 out of 5 stars, which in my mind is a painfully average book. It's not god-awful, but it's average. and not a fun kind of average, more of a slog. And I give it that because it does do a couple of things right. It has a decent overview of Anna May Wong's career. And when it's about her biggest and well-known movies, there's a fair amount of interesting information. But between the sheer volume of the book and how much of that book is not focused on Anna May Wong, and also the fact that it sort of self-defeats its criticism of American racism by supporting a racist regime, it's kind of like, yeah, this book really self-defeats itself in several points. So I can't give it a very high score. I would say I would recommend it to anyone who is not that familiar with Anna May Wong. Like, this does give a pretty decent portrayal of her, and definitely makes you interested in what she could do as an actress. Or if you're interested in Asian Americans at the early 20th century, this might work for you. I mean, the library recommended it, and I can see why they recommend it for Asian American Month. It does do a good job of showing the plight of Asian Americans in the early 20th century, so that it might work for you. But I would say for anyone else, it's a pass, because I've looked it up. There's other books about Anna May Wong, and I have no clue if they're better than this, because I haven't read them. But if there's a lot of different books focused on her, that means it's a wide pool. So you do not need this book if you want to look up Anna May Wong. There's plenty of other books. So for most people, I would say, no, don't check this book out if you're not that interested in Anna May Wong or Asian Americans. If you're not interested in those, I don't think this book will have much for you. Any inspiration? For those that don't know, I'm a working writer, and I always like talking about whether the books I've read have inspired me to focus on any story. If the book has inspired me to write anything of my own. I would say that the main thing this book has inspired is that it does make me want to check out Anna May Wong's films. I'm probably going to be starting a cinema channel soon that talks about movies and television. So maybe watching Wong's films will be a good project for that channel. So that'd be interesting. And yeah, I definitely want to check her out, especially as I get deeper into Fu Manchu books. Daughter of the Dragon is going to come up at some point, even though supposedly it's inspired by a Fu Manchu story more than being an actual adaptation of it. But I'll still check it out after I've read the Fu Manchu book that inspired Daughter of the Dragon. And in regards to if this has inspired me for any writing, this has definitely encouraged me. I'm kind of interested in looking into writing an Asian American heroine at some point. Like the way Huang writes Anna May Wong, she did portray different sort of both villainesses and heroines, and I'd be kind of interested in pursuing a story with an Asian American heroine. And maybe being inspired by some of Wong's films, I could find a way to play with the character types that Wong played in her career and use that in my story. So that could be an interesting project to work on. And yeah, it does sound interesting. So that's all I have for Daughter of the Dragon. For as much as I've been harping about the story, I actually am glad I read it because it did introduce me to Anna May Wong, who I didn't really know much about. And I'll definitely be checking out some of her films in the near future. And I think that's sort of an important thing to keep in mind, that sometimes an experience that's maybe a reading experience that is probably more negative than positive can still have enough of a positive effect that it's worth reading through it. Because it's taught me about Anna May Wong. This book also has encouraged me in some respects to look into the Asian American experience and try to tell interesting stories with that, and maybe find interesting ways to represent Asian Americans in my own work. So I think it is a positive influence, even if maybe I'm not the biggest fan of the book itself. So you should always keep that in mind. Sometimes a negative reading experience has enough of a positive effect that it's worth going through the effort of finishing the book. And that's really a sensation I had when doing this. So, thank you everyone for watching, and I hope I will see you again soon. Bye.